Welcome everyone to the monthly Hazardous Webinar. My name is George Goddard. I'm one of the Node Research Managers at Natural Hazards Research Australia. I joined this organisation about 4 months ago, joining predominantly from overseas community development and resilience, but also having done a lot of work with different remote Indigenous homelands in Australia. So I feel I've been really lucky to have had that set of experiences. And I've recently taken on the chairing of the Reconciliation Working Group at Natural Hazards Research Australia. Before we wanted to get going, I wanted to welcome people to the online space, but I also want to acknowledge that we're all dialing in from different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands predominantly, with the exception of our colleagues, but we're all dialing in from lands that have traditional custodians. The land I'm dialing in from today is Jagun land. I want to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. And these lands have always been used and this country has always been used as a source of teaching and learning, research and wisdom generation and sense making, and that these lands were never ceded. And I've been very lucky in my time in various roles to have had really rich consultations with different Indigenous communities, both here and overseas. But it was only recently when I actually got to meet a Yagara woman at a biodiversity conference, looking at how Australia can meet its biodiversity commitments. And it was a really rich conversation we had there around, we're talking about actually meeting those commitments. It's really First Nations knowledges or Indigenous knowledges that know what does protection look like? What does healthy country look like? What did it look like we're talking about Southeast Queensland, the huge amount of development that's gone on, and where is it we're aiming for? And that actually it's not possible without Indigenous knowledges and those ways of knowing and being, and integrating more of those. And yet there's still a mismatch between, we're starting to, there's greater acknowledgement there, but maybe not actually rewarding people for their time in quite the right way. And certainly it feels like a relevant consideration for the webinar today. So, what is the webinar today? This webinar is launching the Natural Hazards Research Australia's Principles and Protocols for Cultural Land Management, Governance and Research. These were developed through the Cultural Land Management Research and Governance in Southeast Australia project by Bundjalung man Oliver Costello, Centre Board Member and Director of the Jagun Alliance, and a Jagun Alliance Aboriginal Corporation, Dr Tim Neale, Centre Researcher from Deakin University. And I should also mention Ollie's also on the Reconciliation Working Group and does a lot of other work with NHRA. And we're really lucky to have him and both of them on the call today to be able to say hello. I might just invite them to turn their cameras off briefly and do a wave. We'll do a more formal intro later. But hi, Tim. And I'll say a quick hi to Ollie. And I'm going to do, I'm reading this a bit because we wanted to frame the session well today and make sure that we're in the right space given the nature of the conversation we wanted to have. So bear with me. But the principles and protocols that Ollie and Tim have developed and that NHRA have adopted review relevant collaborative principles, processes and protocols for agencies and research institutions, acting as a starting point. Sorry about this. This is me being a numpty. These principles and protocols review relevant collaborative principles, processes, and protocols for agencies and research institutions, acting as a starting point for local and in-depth conversations. They seek to help researchers and practitioners start and sustain truly equitable collaborations, while also mitigating against the harms of extractive research and exclusion from emergency management decision-making. The point is to elevate the potential for our work together to have meaningful outcomes for and with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have occupied a really paradoxical position in relation to natural hazard research and governance. Their rights and interests have often been ignored by researchers, and yet they have also been the target of research rather than its partners or leaders, meaning that the majority of work that has been done has been extractive, harmful, and ignorant of the agency and rights of Indigenous peoples. This is changing, but too slowly. Similarly, Indigenous peoples are amongst the most exposed to natural hazards and their impacts. And yet, as was highlighted at the Australian Indigenous Disaster Resilience Forum in August, emergency management agencies largely fail to recognise the leadership and agency of Indigenous communities in disasters, or tailor support to support equity and response and recovery. This is changing, but again, too slowly. With some notable exceptions, and we'll hear about some of those exceptions today, both have failed to acknowledge the wisdom and resilience of peoples who have cared for country for millennia and continue to do so in spite of systematic attempts to erase Indigenous peoples' ways of knowing and being in the world. The principles presented today will help ensure that researchers and agencies engage communities with humility and respect required to truly listen, and we hope work together positively. So that's just to give you a little introduction to the principles and protocols, and that's one of the presentations we're lucky enough to have today. After they present the principles, we're also very lucky to be joined by Dr. Amy Cardinal Christianson from Parks Canada and Alex Zahara from the Canadian Forest Service, who will be sharing their experiences at the Red Fire Lab. The lab will develop and support research that leads conversations around the rights of Indigenous peoples to steward a healthy and resilient cultural landscape with fire. Through building relationships with underrepresented and minority groups, they aim to strengthen their sovereignty and self-determination in fire management in Canada. So it should be a really rich conversation. We've got those two presentations. After that, we'll have some time at the end for discussion and Q&A. So what we'd like you to do in terms of way to play is please post your questions as you're hearing them or as they occur to you in the Q&A function in the webinar. Post them in the Q&A box at the bottom and we'll get to as many as we can in the session today. We've allowed a bit of wiggle room today just because we know it can be a really rich discussion, but it may not be the whole 90 minutes. We'll just see how we travel. But just a request, if you are putting in a question to be answered by the panel, if it is for someone in particular, please put their name down. So if it's for Amy, for example, please say, hey, Amy, I'd be interested to learn more about this. So that's the overall structure today. Ollie and Tim, Alex and Amy, rich conversations at the end. So looking forward to it. If you've got a seat, you're only going to need the edge of them, is my usual way of starting. So sorry for the corny dad joke. It's probably not an appropriate way to frame this. So anyway, first off, we have Oliver Costello and Tim Neale. So as mentioned before, Ollie is the director of Jagun Alliance Aboriginal Corporation, a Bundjalung land from the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. Ollie has a diverse range of personal and professional experience in culturally connected stewardship of country, focused on Indigenous knowledge and practice in caring for country through regenerative cultural practices that support preparedness, recovery, and resilience for natural hazards. Oliver set up the Fire Sticks Alliance initiative in 2009, runs his own consultancy, and is the vice president of the Northern Rivers Fire and Biodiversity Consortium. In 2022, Ollie was appointed as a Director of Natural Hazards Research Australia. So welcome, Ollie. And thanks for your time. You're obviously quite busy from that bio, so we appreciate your time today. And joining Ollie, we have Dr. Tim Neale, who is a Senior Research Fellow at Deakin University. Tim is an anthropologist and has been combining this with fire science, as well as Indigenous land management. Tim has been a project leader for the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC and is now working on research with Natural Hazards Research Australia. So again, thanks to Dr. Tim for joining us today. And I will hand over to you both because I'm keen to start the listening. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you so much, George, and thanks to Amy and Alex in advance for joining this conversation. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. And thanks NHRA for putting this on. So that's us, and that's the title of our presentation. But with that, I'm going to hand over to Ollie.
Jingala Blagami, hello everyone. Yep, so today we're going to run through this yarn about the principles and protocols. So firstly, just want to acknowledge country, pay respects to elders past, present and future. So Nalina na Jagun, Unijandi, Mandarin, Nagarugan, Guruban, Bihan, Nagarugan. So yeah, we acknowledge country, past elders, past, present and future. We also want to just thank all the old people and all the ancestors and cultural knowledge holders that we've learned from. We're very grateful for their generous sharing of knowledge, which has supported us to continue this journey to care for country. And this is an example of one of them. So this is a painting from my late stepfather, Billy Alawanga, painting the brown falcon courage and moving the fire stick, and so teaching us that fire law and that yarn. And so just one of many of the old people that we just, need to acknowledge. Alina Bilan, Boywan, Guan, Boywan, Jagani, Wera, Mungali, Ma, Brotherhood. So we learn from the wind, the rain, the flood, the lightning, the hail, the fire. They teach us stories. Alina Garama, Lila, Jagun, Garama, Mirad. So we care for country as country cares for us. And so that's a part of an extract of the language statement that Uncle Rick Cook, Marcus Ferguson and I put together for the Extreme Events Chapter State Environment Report. And you can see some of the message sticks that Uncle Mark carved and painted, commissioned by the Natural Hazardous Research Australia. I guess these message sticks, we bring them around to the different forums and events of the Natural Hazardous Research Australia, and it symbolises a commitment that Natural Hazards has to supporting First Nations voices and protocols, and message sticks are an important part of our traditional practice to bring knowledge, and share that knowledge with integrity and intent. So yeah, for the rest of the session, we'll bring that fire stick and message stick yarn to everyone. So yeah, I got plenty of intro, so I'm not going to get into it all, but I got lots of hats. Yes, very busy, Board of Jagun, Natural Hazardous Research Australia, Wildlife Recovery Plan. I do a bit of work with Bush Heritage on conservation futures. This project with Tim and Deakin, co-author the Extreme Events Chapter, State Environment Report, and Vice President, Northern Rivers Fire and Biodiversity Consortium. I was recently appointed to the National Indigenous Australians Indigenous Ranger Reference Group. I was on the last one, and there's a new one being set up. And yes, I was co-founded the Indigenous Fire Sticks Initiative and Fire Sticks Alliance and other bits and pieces. So yeah, lots going on. And I guess that sort of just symbolises, where a lot of people are these days, trying to work across lots of spaces and trying to make the change. And I think it's really important, the work that we've been able to do for this piece that we're going to talk through with Tim, to help progress that that research kind of context and help inform decision making across the sector.
The project that we're presenting on today has a vast range of people involved, and we'd just like to shout out, give credit to some of those people and the research team, as well as our project steering group, who have contributed a huge amount to this work, and a lot of different organizations that have that continue to act as partners for this work over a number of years. Who am I? Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm an academic at Deakin University, associate professor of anthropology there. I'm a non-Indigenous researcher, originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand. So kia ora koutou, koutou katoa. Welcome everybody. I did my undergrad over there, and I came over to Australia in 2010. Thought I was going to be here for a very short time. Turned out I ended up an Australian citizen. But I guess crucially for today, I really began my research into the sector in 2014, thanks to the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC, and began my kind of cultural fire journey in 2016, when I had the great privilege of meeting a number of practitioners, and including Ollie, as well as elders involved in cultural land management here in southeastern Australia, particularly a number of people, but I'd like to give a shout out in particular to Uncle Rodney Carter, and a coffee that we had in 2016 that put me on this road. I've written a number of different things, some of them collaborative and some of them solo, but I like to kind of point people to that essay down the bottom left, because I think that summarizes a lot of the work that I've done with a lot of help from other people. So these kinds of presentations, we like to, Ollie and I like to kind of put the takeaways up front before we get to the meat of the sandwich, and then we'll come back to these at the end. But you see there just some kind of takeaways we hope to people to understand, and that was in George's intro as well, that this is can be a difficult space, but we are very keen to support the creation of good spaces for learning and sharing, as well as understanding the diversity that people are working with across different scales when they do intercultural collaboration, and thinking and always keeping in front of our mind how we're creating pathways for empowering people. So the project background, where have we been? As I mentioned, and as Ollie mentioned, we've been involved in a number of different projects that have brought us to these principles and protocols that we're going to talk about today, starting as early as a 2017 project and a few different bits and pieces, which we'll flash through. That first project, the Hazardous Culture and Indigenous Communities Project, which I co-led with Dr. Jess Weir, really kind of tried to look at, or did look at, some of the kind of headwinds and tailwinds of starting collaborations between Indigenous groups and agencies. In 2017, only 6 years ago, there were a lot of emerging collaborations happening, especially around cultural fire, but few that were up and kind of running. But we endeavored to get around and talk to people. And as you see here, I just flashed these quotes up because I think they're, it gives you some sense of the themes that we found around, when you're starting a collaboration, kind of key things around recognition, connecting people, confronting some of the difficulties, the difficult emotions, as well as capitalizing where you can on people's interests. And then another part of this research was to think about, well, once you've started a collaboration, how do you keep things going? A lot of collaborations start with a kind of a hiss and a bang. There's project money available, there's enthusiasm, and then at some point you need to try and turn into make it ongoing. As people say in the sector, BAU, business as usual. And so you see here, again, from the people we were interviewing, a lot of kind of consistent themes around maintaining trust, continuing to create opportunities, repairing distrust where it does occur, the importance of staying in dialogue as well, and staying in dialogue, with country and on country. So this kind of research, I suppose, led us to think about some key enablers in terms of starting and sustaining, intercultural collaborations. These projects around, changing how we govern land, changing how we research country. This was very useful to know, but we realized in conversation with our partners that there were many further steps to go if we wanted this kind of work to be something people could put into practice. So we highlight 3 here because we're going to come back to them. Again, putting in your mind kind of the key importance of trust, understanding that Indigenous cultures are diverse within and amongst themselves, and making sure benefit it becomes a BAU, not an add-on. It's business as usual. Because it's all well and good, to say, for example, out of this research, you need to create and sustain trust or be open to changing established practice. But, you don't go up to somebody and say, trust me, or, hey, are you open to change? We realized, having identified what works and what doesn't, you need to kind of put those lessons back into some principles that people can use. So that's what we started, as I mentioned, through some of those projects. Here was a project we did with Michelle McKemmy, a great researcher from New South Wales, where we started to think about, principles and structures that could be put in place to support collaborations. And so this piece of work, led to some principles and some thoughts about mechanisms for change, which then led to another project led by Ollie and others, which continue this work through further workshops, thinking about the foundations for Indigenous-led and co-designed research programs. So I'll hand back to Ollie here to talk a little bit about this work.
In short, following the blacks, they call it the Black Summer, the fire started in right here, but the big bushfires in 2019, 2020, there was some that research funded. We ran 3 workshops, South Coast and the North Coast of New South Wales, and a virtual in Victoria because of COVID. And we come up with these 10 recommendations. There's a fair bit in it. Trying to work through all these things that we sort of opened a can of worms in a way. But I guess in short, we sort of focused on in this next iteration of work on recommendation 6. There's a few there that are sort of like a bit overarching sort of pieces, the first few, and then a couple there like 4 and 5 that are more focused at Natural Hazards Research Australia and sort of and so we sort of thought we focused on 6 and 8. So 6 is really around including Indigenous voice and representation in governance structures of institutions and land management. So like making sure that we've got like the functions around informing decision making, collaborative decision making, like raising the voice, and making sure that First Nations voices are making decisions or being heard. And the other one was really around development of a framework for broader research principles and protocols and processes that guide more ethical and collaborative research, which is the nature of this presentation, like the principles and processes, protocols document that we've come out with. So there's lots more to do. So this is really just kind of trying to progress that yarn that's been going on for a long time about how do we inform this research and how do we build those mechanisms and going forward. Which brings us to the current project, really, and so what are why principles, processes, and protocols? Like what are they? So the principle is a fundamental proposition. So, for example, Indigenous people have the right to speak authoritatively for country, and for some people that seems very obvious, but often our voices are not heard, and often there's conflict around like who speaks for country and stuff. And so being able to kind of work through that detail to make it to make sure we've got processes around it. So that's where we go into the processes. So structures that we put in place to support the principle. So example, resource and support Indigenous represented bodies to act as partners. So making sure if we're acknowledging First Nations people have the right to speak about country, well, what is the process for that? Who are the organisations or bodies? What are the functions to guide the research and the different organisations, whether they're government or not-for-profit or Aboriginal? We still need to have processes there, and the protocol. And so that's the practice that constitutes or supports the process. So it's the protocol. So, for example, establish guidelines and requirements for co-design and co-delivery with Indigenous representative bodies. So that's kind of the thinking that's gone into the principles, processes, and protocols.
So we reviewed, as I was saying before, we reviewed the work that we'd done in previous projects, all the conversations, workshops, interviews over a number of years, and also we looked at a kind of the really rich range of resources that have come out particularly from academic and research groups in the field and similar fields of research and practice. And we sought to kind of aggregate this and boil it down to a bit of a guide. What we've produced, which is this one pager, what sits behind it is a larger report which people can read. But what we've produced very intentionally is the idea is not that this is a kind of be all and end all. It's a work in progress, and it always will be, because there's no real absolute rule book to these things. There's no guaranteed recipe. There's no guaranteed fix. Instead, there are what we think of as good guides, and local context really matters above all. And this general guidance is kind of here as a companion piece, as a starting point for local conversations, as we've written on the one pager, with examples for people to work from and discuss in those kinds of local conversations. So you can download that now, that one pager. There are also glossy versions floating around with this beautiful piece of art by Maddie Moser, a Tangerang artist, on the back, and people can get in touch if they'd like some copies of that. But we're just going to talk briefly about some of these principles before we hand over to Alex and Amy. Briefly, I mean, as Ollie was saying before, a lot of these, to people in this space, they make a lot of sense, but we've really tried to kind of put a little bit of more specificity on them and try and ground them for people. I was wondering, Ollie, do any of these kind of pop out as things you really wanted to kind of highlight or?
Yeah, I think like just to reiterate, I guess the importance of these, like a lot of these rights, like the UN rights, the Declaration of Indigenous Rights that Australia's a signatory to. We've got native title holders that have native title rights, and different legislation in different state and territories around land rights and settlement acts and whatnot. So in a way, like, we're not trying to recreate a wheel. I guess we're just trying to kind of articulate some of these functions, you know what I mean? And like, I think the first one, around that self-determination practice to culture and country, like, it's our responsibility as custodians to maintain these connections and these practices. And, we need to be able to do it in a self-determining way. And we've seen the legacy of colonisation and a lot of well-intended actions at different times for different government and different people trying to do good things for us. But often, like, we need to be able to do it ourselves and to be able to set our own direction in a way. And that, that needs to be done in a way that understands the processes that were, like around the second point around, reconciliation, like equity, social justice, like recentering women, I think is really important. Like, a lot of this space, this sort of land management and fire, natural hazard space has sort of been fairly male dominated, and a lot of the structures and systems and stuff are very hierarchical and sort of military in a way. And and I think that feminine side, and when we talk about country, country is our mother, and I think the role of women and that side, I think needs to be understood. And so I'm drilling in, but basically, like, there's lots of elements to these that I think are very central to cultural practice and to restoring practice. And so we're looking at this in a research and sort of cultural natural hazards kind of policy context. But at a deeper level, these are fundamental processes that people need to be able to maintain for their connection and to that restorative process around restoring governance and practice on country. And because linking to the third one, that reciprocity with country, that healthy people, healthy country cycle, the spirit of country, like, it's a real thing. The water in our veins, comes from the country, the air that we breathe, like, the relationship that we have with species and places and stuff is really central to identity and central to everybody's survival. And so there's so many layers of that are really important for people to understand. And, some of it seems very obvious, but I think we have to make these things really explicit as well, and come back to those protocols, processes, and practices. Yeah.
On the left there's Darren Wandon, who's a Wurundjeri guy, and we've got our colleague Vanessa Kavanagh's kids there. And I love this image. This was from a fire workshop, because it just shows, being together on country. We were highlighting earlier, this is about people being in place together and realizing, this can be done together. And it doesn't have to be scary, and it doesn't have to, involve all kinds of elaborate planning sometimes. Here are the other, the back end, the other three of the principles, and I realize that we're coming up to our 20 minutes, so we should probably just kind of flash through these. But again, mention that, you can look at these up, and these are really, intended and provided here as the beginning points for local conversations. And I guess we want to stress this, this stuff about that really kind of strong partnerships, we've seen time and again in the literature, are based on communication and respect and trust. And that takes a lot of work, not only to set up, but to keep maintaining in the space, and kind of understanding also, the diversity of Indigenous peoples and cultures. I think Ollie and I have talked about this before, and you see in places, people have experience in one place, and then they come to a new context and they think, well, that translates, and that can lead, to difficulties, that can lead to misunderstandings. That the premium always has to be on working locally. Again, to return to those takeaways, this work is here to kind of help people provide space to learn and share. This is work that people, collaboration has to be done together, understanding that diversity across different scales, which maybe we'll get into talking about a bit more in the Q&A. And foregrounding and making, keeping our eyes on how we're creating pathways for empowerment, not just recognition.
Yeah, I could go on and on, but I think the main thing is, like I sort of said before, like, you know, a lot of the things that aren't really new things, they're really just, like that cultural safety, that safe space for people to learn and grow, it's nurturing. It's that recognition of, like the diversity and the benefits of that diversity, like all through the continent, what we now know as Australia. We have like cultural stories that connect songlines and pathways to people, across the east, west, south, up and down, all over the place. And so, and you go to all those places and the landscape are different, and people are different, they have different practices and protocols, but they have this shared understanding, and I think that's really where we're trying to go around that, and reiterate those pathways. They're learning pathways, but they're physical pathways that people have walked and sang, and so we're really just trying to get people to understand the opportunity that comes from working in that way. And it's a way of being and doing things, and respecting country and respecting the knowledge holders from that place is the pathway.
I just want to flash up some of the other resources that people can look to. As we were saying before, we have here we're standing on the shoulders of many giants who have done great work in this space before, and there's a lot of great resources for people to call upon as well. Thank you everybody. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Ollie and Tim. That was great. So and thanks for keeping to time. You're doing a better job of that than I am, which is, but hopefully we're going to have lots of good chance to chat more about particular, audience, if you're interested in unpacking some of those principles and protocols more, please let us know. So please start using the Q&A function. We're going to swing back around to that at the end. But just a wonderful resource, and thanks, Ollie and Tim, for taking the time to share it today. I've been really lucky that I've had the opportunity to have lots of direct consultations in previous roles with different communities, and this is a really wonderful distillation of insight that's come from a number of different places. So people that might not have had that experience before, but even as a reminder for those that had that, it does look different. There are different. It's always important, regardless of what you think, to stop, ask, listen, respect, all of these things, and I think that comes through really strongly in this document. So thanks for taking some time. I'm looking forward to the chat at the end of this. But not only did it cut in too much to Amy and Alex's presentation today, so we're really lucky we've got Amy and Alex joining us to speak to some of their experiences from Canada as another working with Indigenous peoples, and also with an emergency management sector is looking to try and be more inclusive, improve practice. And to give you a bit more background, Dr. Amy Cardinal Christian joins us from Parks Canada. She is a Métis woman who works with Indigenous nations across Canada on fire stewardship practices like cultural burning, and collaborates with Indigenous peoples from around the world on decolonising land management. She also studies wildfire evacuations and advocates for Indigenous wildland firefighters, and co-hosts the Good Fire podcast, which looks at Indigenous fire use around the world, and advises Natural Hazards Research Australia as a member of our International Research Advisory Panel. So welcome, Amy. Thanks so much for your time today. And I'd also like to extend a welcome to Alex Zahara, who is an interdisciplinary researcher and wildfire social scientist with the Canadian Forest Service. His academic background includes training in geography, applied geography and science and technology studies, with a focus on wildfire policy and community-led Indigenous fire stewardship. So welcome, Alex. And really looking forward to your presentation today. It's so great to have examples coming in from another context that can help us understand what these principles look like. So I'll hand over to you and stop wittering. Thank you.
Thanks, George. And we will be on time today because Alex just informed me that he has a curling game that starts right after this. So how Canadian is that? Can't miss it. We just wanted to do as well an acknowledgement of territory here. So we're both Alex and I are currently in Treaty 6 territory in Canada. It's a very large territory. We have a map to show later, but we just want to acknowledge our ancestors here and all the people who are working really hard in this space, and then also people where you are as well. So I think we're going to present on the Red Fire Lab. So this is a lab that we're starting on reciprocity, ecology, and diversity in fire. So Alex and I are the kind of co-leads on it, but we have other colleagues, including David Young at the Canadian Forest Service, and then Jordan Twist as well, who's with Prince Albert Grand Council. And Jordan provided all kind of the draft artwork that you'll see throughout this presentation. So thanks to her for that. In Canada, fire research, just like you as well, it sounds like it's focused on non-Indigenous priorities and values and Western scientific practices mostly. There's been very identified gaps in socio-cultural research as well as Indigenous research, but there still remains like a lack of funding and I would say like research going towards that. There's numerous calls for increased involvement of Indigenous people, including the Blueprint for Wildland Fire Science in Canada, which was released in 2018, and that covers on the side there the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we went through in Canada, UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and then as well, many recent Indigenous community publications that were focused on their experiences through hazards that their communities faced. So some people might ask, like, well, why is the federal government a good place for this to happen, you know, given the federal government's role in colonization? And so within the federal government, you know, we have a values and ethics code for the public service that speaks to, you know, the importance of upholding Indigenous peoples. In Canada, our Constitution recognizes 3 different Indigenous groups. So First Nations, of which there's hundreds in Canada, the Inuit and the Métis nations as well, and that are spread all across, as well as inherent adherence, to Indigenous rights. So that's both the inherent rights of Indigenous people to steward their lands, but also rights that were given us through either treaty or modern land claim or modern treaty agreements. And so on the right there is a picture of all the different treaties in Canada that we currently have, as well as you can see little kind of crosshatches on there. That's the location of people in our lab. So I'm the red one there. And then Alex is the blue one. You can kind of see how far Treaty 6 goes, and that was signed in 1876. And then as well as UNDA, which is Canada's take on UNDRIP, and it's also called the Bill C-15 law, which again calls for Indigenous people to be able to steward their territories.
Yeah, so when we're thinking of coming up with this research lab and how to go about doing it, respecting and acknowledging Indigenous data sovereignty is one of our really most important things that we've been thinking about. So particularly coming from the federal government, which has a history of and ongoing colonization, as well as paternalism over decision-making. So when we think about Indigenous data sovereignty, it really links importantly to Indigenous self-determination. So basically the ability for Indigenous people, communities, and nations to really be in charge of making decision-making over their lives and lands. An important aspect of decision-making is having information, so that includes data. So here are some of the practices we've been thinking about. In Canada, OCAP principles are extremely important. So this was developed by the First Nations Information Governance Center in Canada, but it's been widely applied to not just First Nations, but also Inuit and Métis. So the acronym, it stands for Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession of Data. So ownership refers to collective ownership of data amongst an Indigenous community or nation. So it's not any of the research that we do. The data will not be owned by Canada. They'll be owned by the Indigenous nation itself. Control is about decision-making, about what happens to that data. So where will it get published? Who's notified? That sort of thing. Access to data means being able to have access to information that's been collected in a way that's not only just having access to it, but ensuring that it's written and available in accessible ways. So that might involve translating information to an Indigenous language, as well as possession of research data as well. So that can mean that an Indigenous nation possesses the data within their own systems, or perhaps they'll collaborate with the tribal council and they will own it, for example, or they'll possess it. Other things to consider is consent and refusal in research. So by consent, we basically mean that ensuring that you have consent from communities prior to engaging in research that impacts them. Refusal is sort of the flip side of consent. So it's about that control over research. So I've linked here to a short little blog post that summarizes refusal that was written back in 2016. But often it's about, particularly as researchers, you often feel both pressured and entitled to data that you collect. But particularly when working with Indigenous nations, it's important that what happens to the data is decided collaboratively. So this can be meaning, based on feedback, refusing to publish data in academic journals, instead publishing it elsewhere, refusing to study certain particular topics or in particular locations. So one thing about refusal is that maybe it's not always clear. So think about it in terms of like enthusiastic consent. If consent is not enthusiastic, then err on the side of refusal. And then lastly, there's just different mechanisms that you can utilize. So memorandum of understanding, or just general agreements written, or perhaps even just oral agreements with specific nations or groups about what you want to do with data, how it should circulate, and so on. So we wanted to highlight some of the different collaborations that Amy and I have been involved with throughout the years, and how they're sort of informing our thoughts about the lab. So one that I want to start with was a collaboration with the Prince Albert Grand Council. So the Prince Albert Grand Council is a tribal council located in the province of Saskatchewan, Canada. And it's a tribal council that has 12 member First Nations and 28 communities throughout the northern boreal forest, very fire-prone region. And so prior to starting at Natural Resources Canada, I actually worked there for the 2.5 years prior to this. And one of the projects that we worked on was called the Prince Albert Grand Council Wildfire Resilience Initiative, in which the project stemmed from one of the reports that Amy mentioned earlier on, a community-led report called the PAGC Wildfire Task Force Report. And they really emphasized the importance of talking to their community members about how to improve fire response. So one of the things we did with this was hired youth from each of the PAGC First Nations to interview their community members on how to improve fire response, which would then inform PAGC programming. But as I mentioned with OCAP before, really there's always nation-specific protocols. So even when you're working with the tribal council, that doesn't mean that you own all the data. So one of the things that we developed, which is in the top left corner, was the PAGC community research website. So with that, within, if we did research for one of the 12 First Nations, we had a username and password, we uploaded it to that database. That nation has the corresponding username and password, and then can go and access the data that they want or need and that belongs to them. Other thing, so bottom left is an office at the Prince Albert Grand Council. One of the sort of underlying things about our collaboration is I always use their infrastructure when dealing with PAGC member data. So go there, they have a computer set up, use their computer. So all the information is on their servers. And lastly, it was just sort of the interdisciplinary focus of that project. So one of the things that was quite important and that Grand Chief emphasized prior to starting was that we needed to not be prescriptive about the things that we were doing with this project. And that what was important was that the people that we hired wanted to improve fire response for their communities. So because of that, we really had an interdisciplinary focus. We ended up having quite a lot of artists. So some of them we hired because we knew that they were artists, but others ended up realizing, oh, there's other people doing art for this project. I'm also talented. We're also going to do that. And here I wrote yes anding, which is sort of an improv thing that if someone brings forward a topic or skill that they want to do and that they will be good at and that we can support, just say yes and go for it. And one of the things that came up from that because of that is we actually ended up developing an art exhibit, which wasn't one of our intentions initially, but has been quite nice in that we've been able to bring it around to different locations and really demonstrate the work and knowledge that went into that project. Next, we have the We Are Fire project, which is based out of Cumberland House, Saskatchewan, and it's led by Renee and Solomon Carrier. Amy and I have been project advisors on this for the last, at least myself has been for the last 2 years, Amy a bit before that, but this is a project that they've been working on for actually since the early 2000s. It's a cultural burning project based on the Saskatchewan River Delta, and there's a whole website that you can read and check out, which we encourage folks to do. It's called wearefire.ca. And Renee and Saul, and particularly Saul, he interviewed 16 land users about cultural burning practices. Most of the interviews were done in Cree by Saul as well. Then as a group, we helped compile preliminary findings, and Dr. Natasha Caverly, who's like totally an all-star, basically created the website based on that. The website was also peer-reviewed and translated, and peer-reviewed not just by academic experts, but also land users and youth as well. We had youth peer reviewers. One thing that was nice about this project, again, to get to the yes anding, was it developed into a series of camps, which we are now hosting. So one of the tools involved in the toolkit is this infographic. And there's a few things I wanted to emphasize from that. This infographic's available on the wearefire.ca website. It's available in English and Swampy Cree, and it was developed through a sort of collaborative and iterative design process. So the group, I think it was through like 3 or 4 different meetings, met and went over, really had like discussions about what were the key messages that we wanted to bring forward. One thing was that a tool like this has been quite useful, both for education as well as gifting. So we've given this to tons of schools and high schools throughout the province, as well as in Prince Albert, which is where I'm located. In Prince Albert, 50% of the population, it's a town of 40,000, 50% are Indigenous. And a lot of folks are trying to revitalize their language use. So this has been one tool that people are able to look at the English side and then look at the Cree side. So that's been quite helpful. We've also given it to universities and presented it at different scientific conferences. And the scientists are always quite jealous whenever we show this as our poster. It's also been important for gifting. So we've given it to different camp participants, as well as different Indigenous nations and groups, our peer reviewers as well. So again, that sort of emphasized and helped with relationship building. A couple things from here that I wanted to point out was one of the things that came up in our collaborative meetings was gender diversity, age and physical ability diversity. That's really important if we're trying to think about a whole of society approach to responding to fire-related issues. And also it just reflects the makeup of those in our camp as well. We've been doing post-camp evaluation and record keeping, keeping track among many other things as well, but including things like gender diversity. And beyond that, one of the things I just wanted to mention as well is obviously trying to enforce and promote gender diversity requires more than just like pictures on an infographic, but also acknowledging different types of labor that are often gendered. So one of the things we've really tried to emphasize in our work has been acknowledging the work of administrators that tend to be women and involving them in the project, because they also have tons of knowledge, particularly about what is required in order to make something work properly.
Alex, I think you were stuck on, you were stuck on slide 7 there. So I think, can you just go to slide 8 quickly? I think it's just the zoom in on the, there we go.
So yeah, you can see the folks in the wheelchair, different haircuts, people of different ages as well. And the other thing was just like the classroom. One of the things that came up initially was we were talking about teaching and how do we go about teaching cultural burning. And initially the setup was in a classroom, and we thought, well, that's not really how it looks like. So we actually took one of the photos from one of our camps. And then I think Fuse Light Creative, who are the designers, they went and took that. And I think it really sort of demonstrates what it looks like at the camps.
So just the third one there we wanted to feature was the First Nations Wildfire Evacuation Partnership. And so this is a project that I co-lead with Dr. Tara McGee at the University of Alberta. And how this one initially came about was that basically agency people and communities were approaching Tara and I, just telling us about all the problems when the evacuations were happening. So what we ended up doing was just approaching different First Nations and asking them if they wanted to kind of explore this issue, but instead of, from an agency perspective, from their perspective on things that were happening. So we partnered with 7 First Nations across Canada who had recently experienced wildfire evacuations, and we interviewed over 200 people who'd gone through an evacuation process. For many, it was very difficult. Evacuations in Canada of Indigenous communities are generally of remote Indigenous communities that require fly-in evacuation, and evacuations can be months in length. So people were still very traumatized by the experience. And so we did all sorts of different practices with this, partnering with agencies, having local folks on the ground do the interviews, and then asking about like products that people wanted. The main reason why people sat down with us is because they said that they didn't want other people to go through what they did. So from that, we kind of wrote this book, First Nation Wildfire Evacuations, and it's a guide for communities and external agencies. And it's a non-academic book. It basically walks through, what it's like to experience a wildfire evacuation, all the different stages, and then has all sorts of recommendations and advice from communities who went through it before, and things that they had done, things that they would do better. And lots of communities were already doing really good things, so it was awesome to share this with them. And yeah, the partnership is still going. Unfortunately, we're still having tons of wildfire evacuations, and they're still disproportionately infecting Indigenous people, so that work continues on. So the last project quickly to mention is the Thunderbird Collective, and so this is a group that has come out of a recommendation that was made in the Blueprint for Wildland Fire Science. So Natural Resources Canada basically got some money to help support and form this group, and it has representatives from all across Canada. And the first thing that we did was reached out to people across Canada and said, what do you want to see in Indigenous fire? And a big thing that came forward was we need some sort of national body that can advocate for us. And so, yeah, I had this engagement with over 50 Indigenous fire leaders, and it was, all kind of the same consensus there. Then we formed a steering committee, who you can see on the right here, who came up with the terms of reference. And so it's really based around 4 different pillars that the work will focus on. So it's on a knowledge sharing, advocacy for Indigenous nations, land-based practices, and Indigenous sovereignty. So that's currently what we're working on there. From all this, basically, we've been kind of internally, trying to get money basically for doing more Indigenous fire-led research. And so in budget 2022, we received kind of 2 streams of funding. So one was to form a center of expertise, which the government loves for people looking for funding. Center of expertise or center of excellence. It's really government language over here nowadays. And so we got money to form the Red Fire Lab. And then as well, there's a center of excellence in wildfire innovation and resilience that supports Indigenous fire stewardship. Okay, so from this is coming the Red Fire Lab. So we're almost done here. So the Red Fire Lab is an interdisciplinary research hub that will support inherent and treaty rights of Indigenous people to steward a healthy and resilient cultural landscape with fire. Through building relationships with underrepresented and minority groups, we aim to produce research that strengthens Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and promotes reconciliation with fire in Canada. So I think our combination here is also with the queer community, with other minorities and things, other people who also don't get their voices heard in fire management.
Right now, we've been working away at sort of our visioning document. And basically, we've come up to a series of value statements and practices that are guiding the lab. So one is responsiveness to Indigenous needs. So again, this is sort of trying to get away from that kind of prescriptive way. We're not saying that this this lab is going to study evacuation, or this lab is going to study traditional knowledge around cultural burning. We're trying to keep it open so that we're able to respond to Indigenous needs as they arise. Respect for sovereignty of Indigenous nations, communities, and people. Again, that sort of gets back to that data sovereignty piece that we discussed earlier. And lastly, strengthening relationships through wildfire research, which basically means it's going to be a very process-oriented lab. So thinking about strengthening relationships, whether that's between and among Indigenous nations and Indigenous communities, as well as relationships within the federal government and Indigenous nations, as well as relationships between people on the land. And so right now, our sort of draft kind of structure of the lab, we'll have project advisors. So this will include folks like elders, long-term firefighters who have feedback, and they'll be responsible for helping us guide and make decisions about what projects we want to support. Lab facilitators, so that'll be folks like Amy and myself. So we'll be organizing weekly lab meetings in which we'll be working on projects together as a group that are more national in scope, as well as having individual projects that are going to be led by the sort of core staff members, and we'll be supporting them with that. As well as casual terms. So this is sort of our way of keeping our ideas fresh and making sure that we're able to respond to Indigenous community needs as they arise as well. So whether that's having some sort of internship for 6 months so that a person can answer a question that they have about how fire is impacting their community, or other projects along those lines. Lastly, I just wanted to mention the importance of having sort of our guiding values, is that's really going to impact the methods that we do, how we go about doing everything, as well as the projects we decide to fund. And if folks are interested in about methods related to building a values-based lab, I would just wanted to give a bit of a shout out to Civic Laboratory for Environmental Action Research based out of Memorial University. And they have a series of videos called Laboratory Life. And one of them specifically is about the importance of understanding what your values are within a scientific lab, and then how to go about actioning those as well.
Amazing. Thanks both. It was, just thank you for such a rich presentation of such a great exploration of some of those principles we were talking to. And I can certainly see some of these themes emerging really strongly already, but I loved seeing how you managed considerations of the database structure and that community ownership over data and navigating some of that, but also a consideration of broader dimensions of inequity and how to, in terms of the intersectionality and inclusivity more broadly that you could create, and seeing how that's feeding into the lab. Really good news to hear about the budget. Speaks well to being able to sustain those ongoing benefits and the relationships and the trust over the long term. And it really, I think both presentations spoke so strongly to that point that the earlier people are involved in decision making, the more agency you have in the process, the stronger it is as a collaboration. And you can really see that come through in the Red Fire Lab and what you're doing there, as well as still setting it up to make sure that it's adaptive. So but powerful example. Thank you. So thanks to all the speakers for sort of sharing those rich insights. We're now moving into the panel. So Ollie and Tim, I might invite you to come and say hi as well. And we'll aim to answer the questions. We've had some amazing questions coming through, so we're going to get to as many as we can today. If we can't, we're going to try and follow up as well. So and there was a question we could chalk off quite quickly from Zahara. Can we share the slides of the list of resources? Yes, both sets of slides will be available afterwards. So we will send the link to all attendees. So just a reminder, if you wanted to add more questions, please let us know who it's for, or if it's for the whole panel, let us know that as well. Alex, I'm semi-conscious that curling is calling. So there was one question I wanted to ask before we get into this, because I know it's funny to lead with a question for the non-Indigenous panelists, but it's an important one because I think the reality is a lot of the people attending the webinar are probably just statistically non-Indigenous. We can't verify that, but a lot of those individuals will be figuring out how they could be good allies and what their role is in increasing the inclusivity equity within the research space here. And it sounds like Tim and Alex, you've been really good allies yourselves, or I'm hoping so. Amy and Ollie are still talking to you, so it's probably a good sign. So what do you think has been the key? And I might, Amy and Ollie, I invite you to, it's a bit orcs because we're all paneled together, but any observations you've had about Tim and Alex too. But Alex and Tim, I was keen to hear your sort of thoughts on what you felt has been important before we get the review from Amy and Ollie.
For me, a couple of key things have been, and this is the advice I now give to people, especially kind of postgrads entering this space, is, to act with humility, but also patience. That, I think researchers, we have our own pressures, and, those relate to publishing things and getting the data and so on and so forth. And, the priorities of partners, Indigenous partners, may be different. Their timelines may be different. And the part of being a good actor in this space, I think, is being able to talk back to your institution about what's appropriate. And so therefore that sometimes requires, fostering forms of patience that we are not trained in mainstream, white dominated academic institutions. And I guess the other thing, as I said, humility, understanding that going in, and we highlighted this in our presentation, going into a lot of spaces, these are, situations that have been heavily affected, people continue to be affected by dispossession and colonialism, and understanding that going into a space, people may want to be heard, and that there's a lot of feelings around, including our own. And so just having some humility and keeping that humility, I think very important. But Alex, what do you think?
Well, I definitely agree with those things. I think one thing, when thinking about this question before, I think it was initially asked, like, how do you go about being an accomplice? And when I think about that, I often think of like, well, what's your skin in the game? What in what way are you sort of like at risk by putting yourself in situations by doing this kind of research? For me, I think my skin in the game is my community. I really want to still be able to be involved in my community. Like I said, I tend to do research here, so that's a big aspect for me. So doing right by them. But I try not to lead by like thinking about like this is the right thing to do, because I think with a lot of just thinking of like the history of white folks, that can put people in a lot of dangerous situations. So thinking of missionaries, they had a certain idea of what is the right thing to do, versus I kind of thinking about it as more like, okay, so there's a lot of justice related issues in my community as it relates to fire. So how can I assist with concrete resources in that sort of struggle? So, and I think about working with community, I think about like coming with concrete skills and resources. On my end, like my doctoral research has been on the history of fire management in Saskatchewan. So I know a lot of like nerdy ins and out policy stuff that can be useful. That was probably my biggest contribution to the We Are Fire website. Things like within academia, you tend to have a lot of connections, get asked to speak on panels, sort of seeding that space, saying, actually, no, there's so-and-so who's better at speaking about this. So inviting them to be on it, and really trying to funnel resources whenever you can. I think also knowing your limits. So for me, I never try to be an expert on Indigenous knowledge. So if you folks had invited me and asked to do a presentation on the role of cultural burning in the Saskatchewan River Delta, I would have said no, because that's not my knowledge here. So tend to try and, when people do ask me things like that, send them to the right people, send them the right resources. Then I also think about that within government. So kind of as Tim was saying before, bringing things back to your institution. So I come to it with a lens of trying to ensure that myself, as well as the nation that I belong to, which is Canada, are adhering to their obligations to Indigenous people, which includes adhering to treaty rights, adhering to Indigenous rights. So trying to bring that lens into the different projects within government. So often that will come up when reviewing different documents. And also, I guess, trying to take some of the burden off my Indigenous colleagues who get inundated with question after question that are often kind of like 101 type questions, and I know are just like exhausted and then prevent them from doing the stuff that really drives them, which is usually not answering 101 questions for non-Indigenous folks, I imagine. So those are some of the things, I guess, that I think of.
No, brilliant. Thanks both. Amy and Ollie, was there anything you wanted to add there, or any sort of observations about people that you felt have been good allies historically? It felt like that was a really rich summary, Tim and Alex, but yeah. Ollie, I might nominate.
Sure, I was waiting for him to jump in. Yeah, I think it's all about just building relationships and like making space to understand how to I sort of just come back to like being in a forest, and just thinking about like coming into that base and just, I guess, seeing what the opportunities are to kind of support without to take all the light and to take all the water and the nutrients and sort of dominate, because that's been a legacy of like sort of the frameworks that a lot of our allies operate in. They're in universities and government, and often the systems they're operating in are very difficult for them. I've worked in government and university, so I understand that perspective. So I think that's the main thing is just trying to find those lines, and the lines might move, and I think getting those the strength of those relationships in place, early on to understand, and just being able to have trust to be able to have those frank conversations about what's not, so I think that reciprocity in the relationship is really important. Anyway,
because you can't have that conversation without the trust, right? So you need to have the trust to have the rich conversation often. So
I think there's a lot of foundational stuff. We're all humans, and we have different knowledges and diversity of experiences and stuff, and I guess that's the challenging space to understand. Like, why is it that we're working together? What is the intent of that? Like, what are the benefits that come out of that, and how do we share in the benefits of that? I think the sort of principal things. Obviously there's a lot of power relationship issues often in these situations, because often they're always coming to us because they have like resources or project ideas and different things like that. But not it goes both ways as well. But that's often the nature of the formation of these relationships. I remember vividly Tim calling me up. I was like on holidays in Minjerribah. I was like, what's this all about? Trying to, and me being like, kind of, these are some of the things that I think, if I'm involved, these are things that are important. So just kind of like, just being upfront and just trying to establish those protocols. And if, they reciprocate and we work together, then they obviously heard, and we've got a good relationship, and it helps to hang out outside of work and just build relationships as well, So we're like humans, Anyway.
Thanks,
that's
Ollie.
why I brought Ollie to a gay bar when we were in Edmonton. Share part of my culture.
There you go.
That was very enlightening
It's
experience.
TY knowledge sharing at its best. Love it. How about you, Amy? Did you have anything to add to that?
I'll just add one quick point on what Alex mentioned at the beginning, risk. And so I think for us, when research goes bad for non-Indigenous people, like it might be a grant that they lose or a paper they don't write or something, but when it goes bad for us, it can have horrific consequences, to be honest, like the loss of rights or loss of land or, loss of elders' knowledge. Like there's a whole huge thing that goes in there. So it's really just realizing that it's not kind of an academic game, I guess, that it's being played. There's a lot more at stake here for us. And then just quickly on the other one, I think, what I appreciate about Alex is that he's all about support. And like, I get so many emails, especially with the podcast, from people that literally say like, Amy, like, please take me out. I want to learn your ways from your elders. And it's like, no, like, we're not doing that. Like, what we need our allies and accomplices to do is to work with us to remove the barriers that they put in place that make it hard for us to carry out our cultural practices. So yeah, I think Alex's work is much more on the policy and other sides, which I always really appreciate, of removing those systems that are in our way.
Yeah, it's that rich sort of actually helping navigate some of those systems that are more hierarchical or don't necessarily create that space. And I think that came through in your spot as well, Tim, and taking some of the heat off as well. Ollie, you had your very polite hand
I just want to pick up on something Amy said, just around, I guess, a way to express it around like cultural load that a lot of First Nations, Indigenous people, Aboriginal people have, I guess, working in these spaces, and that like it's not just a job that we can turn up to, like it's in our lives, in our communities. And so that's an extra kind of challenge, I think, that we have to, like I say that, we should I work for country number one, and so that just puts a lot more pressure on us engaging, in these different spaces, like working in them, but also, and in relation to our allies, I guess that's something that they can do is, help us to avoid, like just help us with cultural safe space and, like just kind of building space and like trying to help reduce some of those impacts on us by being good allies, like, and not doing things that are bad for us, but also by trying to lift the standards of the organisations and their peers as well, so they become good role models and good examples of different practice. But so I think there's just something in that sort of that context, like often people can just come and go from jobs and different things, but for a lot of us, it's not that simple. We have to live with the legacy of the impact. I've definitely been involved in lots of projects and organisations and activities and stuff that I'm not fully comfortable with all the outcomes and but obviously, I've tried to do the best I can in those situations. But you have to live, like sometimes good policy outcomes from one perspective can also lead to legacy challenges as well. And so, I guess it's just understanding that, and being conscious of that, that it's not just a paper or a project, it's actually our lives and our communities' well-being in our country. And that can have long-term, indefinite impacts.
Yeah. I think that's what it spoke to me with the Red Fire Lab, having that really adaptive, ongoing consultation. Like, let's make sure it's still working for people, so we avoid some of those legacy impacts as well, or mitigate them and can recognise when that's happening, or have that honest space. And you need that trust there to have that frank conversation about what's working well and not. But thanks, team. It's really rich. Unpacking of that allyship, accompliship. That's probably not there, but I like the accomplices term, Tim. I can see you're also answering questions in the chat, so thanks for that. So one of the questions that came up, which is from Steve, was, can you comment, Tim and Ollie, can you comment on how we address the issue of historical loss of traditional knowledge about fire's place in caring for country among some Indigenous communities? So it's a pretty big question, that one, but any sort of specifics or examples that you're thinking of to help Steve answer Steve's question?
Yeah, there's a big yarn there, but just in short, I did respond. But to me, really, it's around the knowledge sharing. And not just like often we sort of get focused, say, around fire and stuff. People have these perceptions about what fire knowledge is because of, I guess, what we see on TV and what people talk about in agencies and research papers and stuff. But fire knowledge is knowledge of country and values and connections. It's the species, the places. And so there's quite a lot of knowledge around fire that's really prevalent, and maybe some communities haven't been able to maintain that practice of knowledge. They have knowledge, but maybe not practice, or even the knowledge, of how to burn and where to burn and different times and seasons and species and stuff. But yeah, like sharing that knowledge, learning from other knowledge holders and stuff. But you're mainly learning from country, like country was the first teacher, and it's the main teacher, and like country's changing and, so that's really the main process is like imagine you're the first person there and there was no one there before you and, like start to like work it out as best you can and share that, so it's not just you're starting to network and share that knowledge with other people, because that collaboration and diversity decision-making is really important. But like I said, acknowledge, the birds and the plant, they're all knowledge holders and teachers, and so don't just worry about, the people, think about everybody that you can learn from.
Thanks, Ollie. And Tim, I could see you had a thought you wanted to contribute there.
Yeah, I've very politely put my hand up. I'm gonna, I guess, say a slightly blunt answer as a non-Indigenous researcher. I've definitely had a number of interactions with non-Indigenous researchers and agency people, and I'll ask them, why don't, you're doing this project, why haven't you collaborated with the local traditional owners? And honestly, sometimes they'll say, oh, well, I went to them and they didn't know what I wanted them to, they didn't know, the thing I wanted them to know, some kind of specific piece of cultural knowledge. And so therefore, I didn't bother. And my response to that is, one that I guess take a cue from our colleague, Amy Williamson. We talk about historical loss of knowledge. It wasn't lost like something out of a back pocket. It was taken and stolen. And so for me, the first principle or the reason you do this work is not because Indigenous people have something to tell you. They might not want to tell you. They might not want to tell you. You do this work and you do the collaboration because it's their country and they the traditional owners of that country. And that's the place to start, not from, do you or do you not have a piece of knowledge that I want?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important reflection that actually you need to put aside what your specific objectives are and start to acknowledge where you are, the place, and whose country that is, and starting from there. But Ollie, you wanted to...
Yeah, just quick, because I don't want to bang on too much, but exactly, Tim's got a really great point, and Army as well. And like one of the things I was trying to say is, often when we do yarns with community and workshops and stuff, we talk about protocols and principles for sharing and stuff. And one of the things I always like try and say is that there's no expectations for people to share. If people don't answer a question or get involved in the discussion, my assumption is not that they don't know. My assumption is that they're not willing to share. And it may be they don't know, but it may be that they don't want to tell us. It may be that the question isn't the right question. It may be that the place isn't the right place to ask that question. There's always the protocols, and it has been a legacy issue that, researchers or government turn up and, they don't know who to talk to and, they call the land council, I've tried to talk to people, and sometimes it's just not the right time or the right people that you're talking to. And so just don't make those assumptions, and always just kind of, I guess, provide that safe space for people, build a relationship, and if people want to share stuff with you, they will, like, even like, Aboriginal people, we have knowledge sharing protocols that are thousands of years old where you can't just expect people to tell you stuff. You have to earn the right, be in the right place at the right time. You have to turn up, for people to see you and to think that you can handle that knowledge. And so that's just a part of the journey, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a continuing understanding that needs to be grown over time. I'm conscious that we've got sorry, this is about taking the time having the conversation, but we've also got the 5 minutes left, so try not to step on that insight. But wanting to there's a couple of quick ones. Thanks to all the panelists who've been doing a really good job of answering the questions as we go through the chat as well. There was one that was I thought was possibly a quick one, but for Alex and Amy around the Red Lab. And do you have finite finite or open-ended funding from the government for that. So it sounded like there's been a good recognition it's ongoing, but I think maybe they're looking to see, can we evidence that to increase the ambition in Australia, but it's not always the case. But yeah, it's just hopefully, yeah, if that's okay to share as well, I would say so. Please say no, if not.
Yeah, in the budget, it was a sustained funding contribution in Canada. So there's a certain set amount for 5 years, and then but a sustained kind of base amount that can keep things going. But obviously it's the government game, right, where you're trying to get funding. I will just say quickly that the budget process, like it might sound great that we got it, but it was not fun to get. Like it's very hard justifying like your existence and your way of life to multiple policymakers and, being told it's not, that there's other issues. So anyways, it's just, yeah, I would say it was a long, hard fought process to get that funding in the end.
Yeah, I think that mirrors a lot of experience that community members have had chats to trying to get grants post-disaster to support and having to justify their values around why it is that they need, what recovery looks like from their perspective. So
yeah, another just quick thing too is that budget requests in Canada too are confidential, right? So you have to have certain security level clearances, which make it very different to collaborate with communities on trying to obtain funding on projects together and collaboration. So that basically directly works against exactly what we're trying to say here that people should do.
Yeah, and that's I think in trying to navigate that and those systems that are sort of thrown up, obviously not designed with that kind of collaboration in mind, when obviously that's the essence. I think that's probably what a lot of, when we're talking about allies accomplices earlier, that's actually one of the critical roles, right, is actually trying to educate up to government about why it's not working for a lot of the communities you're engaging with. So but thanks for that reflection on the process as well, because I think it's important to bear that in mind, that actually governments can be doing things a lot better in that regard. Might just try and chop off this Peter's question at the end here, but it's quite a big one, so we'll see how we go. Sorry about my chairing, but it's just because it's addressed to any presenter today or any of you panelists. In terms of cultural IP data sovereignty, non-Indigenous organisations often have culturally sensitive info shared with them. Failure to handle, store, manage and share this respectfully is a real risk for those organisations that quickly erode trust with First Nations partners or Indigenous partners. What guidance do you have on handling info in a culturally safe and respectful way? Maybe too big a question to chalk off. I think we've got 1 minute, but did anyone have a quick? It felt like there were some good lessons learned, particularly from Red Fire Lab or the precursors to that, but does anyone feel comfortable speaking to that one? Sure. Yeah. Hi, Ollie.
Yeah, if nobody else wants to. It's a real challenge. Like, I've worked in a few different organisations where there isn't appropriate systems in place, and some Aboriginal organisations have their own systems and stuff, and we should look to support and to build them up. But as a pathway to try and deal with this challenge that I've had from lots of different examples, I'm working on a project called Conservation Futures, I mentioned in my intro, with Bush Heritage Australia and Melbourne Uni. And so we've built a bit of a prototype that helps us to it's an integrated knowledge system. So it's a web platform that you can visualize different data. And so we've built some protocols into it so individual users can have control of their data. And that's how we think it needs to be managed. We think knowledge holders or representatives of knowledge holders need to be the ones that manage and maybe have different levels of knowledge or data that they share around that, without getting too far into it. But if you've got a place that has a site that you want protected, you don't want someone to bulldoze it or burn it or whatever, you might put like a big splashy polygon over it so they can't necessarily find it. But in that area, the knowledge holder might want it specific, but they might want it blurry and it says that you have to come and talk to them, and they'll let you know whether you're going to have an impact or how to manage it. And then that's what people see. It could be public, could be just in a layer for different partners or agencies, whatever. And then below that, they might have some yarns and photos and stuff they want to share with some different partners or community, and then maybe below that as well, there's another layer that's like the really deep cultural story that they only tell like their family, you know. So, but they're in control and they can choose who has access to what layers, and so that's kind of the process that we've been working in. So that way, you know, different agencies and government partners can access the bit that they need, that people want to share, but they can maintain the integrity of their knowledge and the system in control, that self-determination, data sovereignty, because data sovereignty is like you're controlling it. It's not somebody else's yarn, you know?
Yeah. It's a really good example, and it speaks to being able to respect traditional knowledge systems as well around how that's controlled, actually be able to enable that to some degree. So thanks for taking time to share that. I'm really sorry, team. I've done a not very good job of sharing today, but that was a really rich discussion. I'm sorry I didn't have more time, but thanks so much for answering some of those questions on the coming through on the Q&A. So yeah, just a big, I probably will need to wrap up. Alex, thank you for sticking with us. I know there's other commitments calling, and you know, Amy, family, other things you've all got other commitments on. So I just wanted to say a huge thanks for your engagement today, panelists, and being so generous and sharing your knowledge in this space and helping share the principles, but then paint such a rich picture around what that looks like in practice. And also to the participants, some cracking questions coming through. I really love those. So I'm sorry we couldn't talk about all of them in plenary, but you've got some rich answers coming through, and any we didn't get to, we're going to try and come back to you on. We are going to be developing a web page or a page on our website that can help support the messages shared today and provide some of the high-level guidance and resources for researchers on how to engage with for Indigenous peoples with respect and cultural safety. So we will share that link with you as well when it's available. It will be available probably after that recording. We'd like to hear from you as well. So about how useful you have found the information discussed this morning, the conversation, the questions. And we welcome your thoughts. So we always want to be doing things better. We want to be listening, trying to make sure we're having the kind of impact that you want through these sessions as well. And we have plenty more events coming up online in person in 2024, so just to whet your appetites. I can't share a specific example to do that, but yeah, watch this space. For updates on everything from NHRA, please sign up to our newsletter and follow us on social media. Just a huge thanks again, everyone. I really appreciate your time today. Thanks to all the participants for coming and listening, and hope this is going to help you in your journey moving forward. So, but yeah, and have great rest of your days, evenings, everyone.